comes from the Decameron. It's Italian from Messina from the 14th century. And it starts with a woman named Lisabetta. Now, Lisabetta, well, her father died. And so that made her an orphan because her mother had not actually survived her birth. But she was not alone. No, she was not alone. She had 3 brothers, 3 older brothers. And they had inherited the charge of the family business. It was a shipping and import-export business. And as you might imagine, it did rather well during Renaissance Italy. They had a fleet of ships and warehouses all around Messina. And so business was good with consumer confidence and leading economic indicators were good and all of that. But her brothers were not only charged with taking care of the business, but they were charged with taking care of Lisabetta, who, of course, as a young woman that long ago, could not be responsible for taking care of herself. Oh no, she needed 3 older brothers to take care of her. And one day, as they were reviewing the books and thinking about their assets and the ships and the cargoes of the ships and all, they realized that potentially their greatest asset was not in any of the ships, and it was not in any of the warehouses, but in fact it was in the palazzo, because their potentially greatest asset was Lisabetta. They figured that they could arrange a marriage, sort of a merger of sorts. They could arrange a good marriage for her. They could double their net worth overnight. And so they took great care of what they did with Lisabetta. They hired the best instructors and the best tutors that they could to come in and teach her all of the most valued womanly arts, and those would be things like embroidery and calligraphy and playing the lute and things like that. And they kept a good watch on her. They never let her go anywhere alone. They wanted her to be safe, and they wanted her to retain her value, so to speak. Well, the business flourished. It did so well that one day, in looking over the books, the brothers realized that, well, really, the business was doing so well that they could no longer really be expected to keep track of the day-to-day expenses. And in fact, they had enough excess income that they could hire somebody to help them with those nasty little ledgers and things like that. And so they hired an accountant. He was a young man from Pisa, not noble, but of a good family, and he came well recommended, sort of a lower socioeconomic class, kind of their idea of affirmative action and economic stimulus, you know that. And so they brought him into the palazzo. They had one wing of the palazzo that was just for their business, and they put Lorenzo in a little room that was right next to the main offices. And they gave him a big stack of paper and ink and quill pens and anything that he would need to keep the books exactly the way they wished for them to be kept. Well, one day, Lisabetta, whose room was on the 2nd floor, on the exact opposite end of the palazzo, she had a question for one of her brothers, and she decided to get the answer right away. And so she came out of her room and down the corridor, down the wide marble staircase and the corridor of the business wing. And then, just before she got to the offices, she noticed something. There was a door that was open that usually wasn't open, and she glanced in, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. Well, actually, she saw someone she hadn't seen before. It was, of course, Lorenzo. He was sitting at a desk, and she really didn't see much of him, just the top of his head as he was bending over, writing something in a large parchment ledger book. But she saw the dark curls, and, well, probably when she stopped, when she paused at the doorway, it must have cast a shadow. And so Lorenzo knew that somebody was there, and he looked up, and their eyes met, and that changed everything. Well, after that, Lisabetta thought of a lot of other questions she wanted to ask her brothers in person. And so pretty much every day, she was down in that wing of the palazzo, and she would always pause as she passed Lorenzo's office. And then one day, she ventured a shy greeting. And another day, when she knew that her brothers were in town on business, she greeted him and asked a question. He beckoned her to come inside. As soon as she was leaning over him, as he pointed out something very important in the ledger book, and as she leaned closer, he could feel her presence. He could smell her perfume, and he could feel the pearls of her necklace graze against the back of his neck. Well, In a moment, they were locked in an embrace, and after that, they saw an awful lot of each other. Now, it doesn't take Facebook or even those newspapers that you see at the supermarket checkout counter to really spread a rumor. They could do it back in Renaissance Italy, too. Mostly it was the servants who began to talk about Lisbetta and Lorenzo. And finally, the rumors got to Lisbetta's brothers, who were livid. They were outraged. How could she do this to them? If this was true, it had certainly diminished her value. And after they had taken such care, after they had given her everything, thus echoing the future whining and complaining of most parents. How could she do this after all they had done for her? Well, her older brother said, now, we don't know that it's true. At this point, it's just a rumor. And he believed in the very important maxim of trust but verify. And so he set out a watch on Lisbetta, and sure enough, one day, one early morning, he saw Lorenzo leaving Lisbetta's room. And then he knew that what the servants had said was true. And so he met with the other brothers. They had a meeting, they made plans. And the plans were all about Lorenzo. Come on in. The plans were all about Lorenzo. But really, in the days and weeks that followed their planning session, Lorenzo would not have known that. Because they were, if possible, nicer to him than ever. They were more solicitous of his opinions. They were more complimentary of his work. And he began to feel like he had a real career going there. That he could maybe rise through the ranks and possibly become a partner. He had plans to become a wealthy industrialist like they were going to. And so he was very pleased with the way things were going. One afternoon, Lisbetta's brothers invited Lorenzo to come with them into the city for dinner. And he was delighted. He felt like that proved that they were really considering him an equal. And so he set off with them, filled with high hopes and excitement. And so there were 4 young men who went to the city that evening. But only 3 arrived. Because outside the south wall of that city, the deed was done, the one that had been planned weeks before. Lorenzo didn't suspect a thing, not a thing, until he saw the sharp daggers, and then it was too late. When they had killed him, and they buried him in a shallow grave between 2 cypress trees, and then those brothers, they went on to dinner. Lisbetta, the next day, she was down in the business wing of the palazzo, and Lorenzo was nowhere to be found. And the next day he was not there, and the next day he was not there. And after an entire week, one night at dinner, in a voice studiously calm and casual, she tossed off a little comment. So, what happened to that accountant that you hired? What was his name? Leonardo? Fabio? But I don't think I've seen him around lately. And the brothers exchanged sharp glances. And then the eldest brother said what they had planned for him to say. He's away on business. That was all. But in a tone of voice so sharp and so strong that she knew better than to ever bring up the subject again. And still, of course, she could not so easily forget Lorenzo. She waited for him day after day, and she worried about him, and she watched for him. And she found herself eating little and sleeping little. At night, she tossed and turned with worry. When she was alone, she called on him, asking him where he was and when he would return, and how he could possibly desert her like this after all that had passed between them. And then one night, Lorenzo did appear to Lisbetta. Was it a dream or a vision? Who knows? But it was Lorenzo, for sure. She knew. Although he was much changed, his face was white, deathly white, with a gash of scarlet at his neck and another on his forehead. His eyes were sunken deep in his skull. His dark curls were matted and dull and filled with leaves and He looked at her and he said, Elisabetta, do not wait for me. Do not seek for me, for I am dead, killed by your brothers. And then he told the gruesome details of the murder and even told her where he was buried outside the south wall of the city. And Elisabetta woke up with a scream. And she knew what she needed to do. And she knew exactly how she was going to do it, too. It wouldn't be too difficult. The next morning, she told her brothers that she was going to go to Mass. She knew that they would let her go into the city for that. She knew, of course, that she would have to take 2 of her maids with her. But she also knew that they would pass through the marketplace. And like the marketplace out there, there was much to see for young women. Many adornments. She knew it would be not difficult to lose those maids. And sure enough, when they got to the marketplace, she left those 2 maids giggling over a tray full of jeweled bracelets. And she slipped away down the back alleys of town, out the south gate of the city. And then she looked, and it was not difficult to find Lorenzo's resting place, if you could call it resting. For there it was, a spot of newly disturbed earth between 2 cypress trees. She fell to her knees and she began to scratch in the dirt. Her hands were not hardened and used to such work, so soon her nails were ragged and her skin was bleeding, but she kept up. And it wasn't too long, really, before the grave yielded the body of Lorenzo. And she fell to the ground. She cradled his corpse in her lap and bathed his face with her tears. And she made a decision. I think something sort of snapped. Who can tell why it happened, but, well, desperation and despair will do odd things to a person's mind. And so she knew that she could not leave him there. But she couldn't take him with her either. He was way too heavy for that. And so, in a moment of desperation, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small knife, a penknife, and she cut off his head. It was harder than she thought, cutting through the bone and sinew with that small penknife, but after a while she'd accomplished what she set out to do. And then she wrapped the head in a petticoat. Back in those days, young women had more than enough petticoats. There was always enough to spare one. And so taking her grisly bundle with her, she hurried home down the more deserted byways. She didn't come in the main door of the palazzo, but came in through the kitchen entrance and up the back stairs and directly into her room. And then she had a problem. She had Lorenzo's head, but what was she going to do with it? I mean, she couldn't just lay it there on the pillow where it had so often lain when he was alive. She couldn't put it in the wardrobe. She couldn't put it under the bed. There were not a lot of possibilities. Then she stepped out onto the balcony, and the balcony had a row of terracotta pots, large, round terracotta pots, in which were growing flowers and herbs. And that gave her an idea. She picked one of the pots and took out the herb that was growing in it. It was some fine Salerno basil. She took out the basil, and she took out some of the dirt, and then wrapping the head in a clean damask cloth, she put the head inside the terracotta pot, replaced the dirt and the basil. After that, Elisabetta didn't go out too much. She stayed close in her room and often on the balcony, where she could be seen seated right next to that pot of basil, sometimes with her hand on the rim of the pot, sometimes with her arm around the pot. And she took such care of that basil. Every day she watered it with rose water, and every day, to tell you the truth, she watered it with her tears. And the basil flourished. Whether it was the rose water or the tears, or maybe it was just the decomposing head there underneath the basil flourished, and it grew thicker and sweeter and more luxuriant than any basil anywhere in Italy. But if the basil flourished, alas, the same could not be said for Elisabetta. For for if she ate little and slept little before, now that was multiplied. She grew thin and wan, her hair grew brittle and lifeless, her cheeks sunken. And one night at dinner, her brothers happened to look at her, and they were shocked when they saw her. How had she become like this? And more importantly, for their economic bottom line, who would marry a woman who looked like her? She was destroying their riches as she sat there. Why? Why? And so they began to ask around, what was different? What had happened? Well, the servants were not much help. They said nothing had happened. She didn't really go out much. She just stayed in her room or on the balcony sitting next to her favorite pot of herbs. Didn't give them any clues. But they needed to find out what the problem was. And so one day her eldest brother suggested that she go to Mass and sent a couple of her maids with her, admonishing them to stick with her this time and not get distracted by jeweled bracelets. And then as soon as she was gone, the three of her brothers descended upon the room, looking for any clue to their sister's decline. And they looked all through the bed and the bedclothes. They looked through the wardrobe and her clothes. They looked all around the room, and nothing seemed amiss. And then her eldest brother stepped out onto the balcony. And he saw that row of terracotta pots. And suddenly he remembered what the servants had said, that she seemed to sit next to a favorite pot of herbs. It wasn't hard for them to figure out which was the favorite pot of herbs. It was the basil, of course, the Salerno basil, growing thicker and sweeter and more luxuriant than anywhere in all of Italy. It was certainly better than any of the other pots of herbs there on the balcony. And as her brother looked at that pot of basil, he knew. And so when the thought struck him, he struck the pot. It turned over and broke, and out rolled Lorenzo's head. Well, Lorenzo changed quite a bit since the last time the brothers had seen him, but it was still pretty obviously Lorenzo. Furious, the brothers, they swept up the whole mess. The pot shards, the dirt, the basil, the head. They took it all out the door and buried it in back of the kitchen garden. It wasn't long before Elizabeth came back from Mass. She went right up the stairs and down the corridor and into her room. And then a most heart-wrenching scream was heard. And she burst from her room, running down the corridor. She accosted the first servant. She saw, "My pot of basil! Where's my pot of basil?" The servant stared and shrugged, and she kept running. Everyone she ran into, "Oh, where's my pot of basil? What have they done with my pot of basil? I need my pot of basil." Down the staircase and down to the offices where her brothers were gathered. "What have you done with my pot of basil?" she said. "I need it. Give it back to me." They glared at her in stony silence. Receiving no satisfaction, she turned and ran back again out of the offices and up that staircase, down the corridor and into her room, and out onto the balcony where she jumped and landed in the courtyard below. So, let's see, Lorenzo is dead, and now Elizabeth is dead, and those are the main characters of the story. The brothers, well, we don't know what happened to them. We can only, in a little deep, dark, mean-spirited corner of our hearts, hope that their demise was just the sort of thing that they deserved. And we draw a curtain on that part of the very sad and tragic Renaissance Italian story. Just one thing more. If you should go to Messina today, and you should, it's a beautiful place, you can see the palazzo. It's still there. In fact, you can even stay there. It's been turned into a sort of an inn, a rather upscale Renaissance Italian bed and breakfast. And it's expensive, but not outrageous. And if you're feeling brave or curious, you can ask for the room on the second floor, the one that overlooks the courtyard. Just be prepared that in the night, you may have a ghostly visitor, a woman dressed in long, flowing white dress who enters from the corridor and seems to be looking frantically, ever more frantically, for something in the room, and then exits out the doors to the balcony with a scream. But if you don't have the time and money for that, well, very least you should eat in the little trattoria there on the corner of the palazzo. It's where the kitchen used to be. Oh, and the food is really good. They're famous for their focaccia bread. It's baked up fresh every day, where it's gold and brown and drizzled with the finest olive oil, sprinkled with cheese and herbs. They're famous for their basil, of course. They grow it in the kitchen garden, where for some reason no one can explain, the basil seems to grow thicker and sweeter and more luxuriant